This episode is supported by PIMCO, a global leader in active fixed income with deep expertise across public and private markets. PIMCO invests their clients' capital in income and credit opportunities that span the liquidity spectrum, leveraging their decades of experience navigating complex debt markets. Their flexible capital base and deep relationships with issuers have helped them become one of the world's largest providers of traditional and alternative investment solutions and a valued financing partner. Visit PIMCO.com to learn more.
You don't always have to be the smartest. You don't always have to be the star, but you can make up for it with work ethic. And I've always followed that piece of advice. I still remember it to this day, and it really does make a difference. I would say be the best version of yourself. I really try to live up to that and remind myself of that at least on a weekly basis. And if you don't know what that is, the best version of yourself, or you haven't gotten there yet, it can really be a fun journey to find yourself.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Kristina Blaschek, who is Director of Business and Technology within the Investment Management Division of William Blair, based in Chicago. She started her career in investment banking and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Auditorium Theatre. Welcome, Kristina. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Aoife. I'm so excited to be here and have this great conversation.
Well, let's start where we always start, which is a little bit about your background. And you've had an interesting pivot in your career from investment banking to business and technology. Can you just start with where you grew up, what you studied, and how you ended up maybe making that first turn?
Happy to. Well, in the earlier years, I was born and raised in the Chicago area. My parents actually still live in the southwest suburbs, not far from where I live today. I did come to finance relatively late. I didn't find a place I really found passionate as a child, a skill set or niche of my own per se. And as a teenager thinking about college, I was interested in science and math, but only because I was good at them. I began my undergraduate studies at Loyola University, Chicago, as a biochemistry major, pre-med. It was fun initially, and then I began to struggle. But I continued to pursue it. I ultimately finished my pre-med requisites, and I actually took the MCATs as well. But sophomore year, I took an accounting class, which was a subject I didn't have any exposure to growing up, and it really resonated with me. So I took some other business classes purely out of curiosity, and I got an internship at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange on the exchange floor, which really ages me. Then somewhere between sophomore and junior year of college, I realized I wanted to study business instead of medicine. So unbeknownst to my parents and probably to their disappointment initially, I switched all my classes from the pre-med curriculum to finance. I ultimately graduated in December of 2001, Ethan. It was just after 9/11, and it was really tough to find a job in finance. But I was lucky to be in Chicago, which had a number of great financial institutions, and I joined the capital markets rotational program at Bank One. That gave me really great exposure to different areas of the business. And when JP Morgan acquired Bank One, I joined the investment banking arm. Later, I worked at a Minneapolis-based firm called Goldsmith Agio Helms that ended up being acquired by Lazard Middle Market. It was really exciting. I was a young analyst. I got exposure to the most senior executives of companies. I felt like I couldn't keep up with peers, though, who grew up around finance or had a stronger educational background. So I struggled from time to time in that area. I decided to get an evening MBA at the University of Chicago while being an investment banking analyst. And unfortunately, I did get a little burnt out because of that. However, a classmate who worked at William Blair at the time was moving to Texas and was looking for her replacement. She suggested I come in, meet her boss, and learn about the company. I thought I was coming in for a coffee chat, but it was an interview, and it went well. So I joined William Blair as a sell-side research associate covering healthcare services. That was 16 or 17 years ago.
That's really interesting, the point you made about not having that kind of family, I suppose, history or legacy investing in finance and not having maybe the grounding in that, because not often will people admit that. But actually growing up around the vocabulary, the risk-taking, just the expectation of business is quite important. So it's interesting and I guess very self-aware of you to see that gap.
It was interesting, particularly as you mentioned, because the jargon was what I was least familiar with. And it was almost as if I was learning a completely different language. But at the same time, I saw that connection with math and it was fascinating to me. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to give this a try, and I continue to pursue it.
Really interesting. Let's go back to then your early days at William Blair and how that went.
Yeah, so at William Blair, then I started as a sell side analyst. So moving from a sell side analyst role to a business technology role was a windy path. The woman who managed the buy side research associates at William Blair was retiring and looking for her replacement and asked if I'd be interested. And it was an intriguing opportunity. I would move from the sell side to the buy side, but I wouldn't actually be covering securities anymore. I'd be working with 2 directors of research to manage the research associate program and help with the operations and administration of investment research. But again, this was also scary for me. I was in my early 30s and I didn't have any experience managing people. I reached out to a mentor at the time, and I recall asking him, what should I do? And I remember him saying, could you get this job somewhere else if you applied for it? And I said, absolutely not. I don't have the qualifications. And he responded, it sounds like your organization sees something in you and is giving you an opportunity to develop. Why don't you try it out? Worst case, you don't like it, and you can go back into doing research and analysis. So that's what I did. I was in that role for quite a few years, loved it. I got to work with young people, trying to figure out how to train them in finance for their current roles and careers that they would ultimately have. In that role, I also made a lot of relationships, including with a portfolio manager, Stephanie Braming, who has also been on your podcast, and who would go on to lead investment management at William Blair. Stephanie had the foresight to see that tech was going to be a bigger component of the asset management industry than many thought at the time, and a new role was created to focus on tech innovation and development for our investment teams, as well as sales, marketing, and distribution. And I got promoted into the role. I recall going into her office, seeing HR there, and thought, oh no, I'm getting fired. But they said, this is a promotion. You're going to lead tech. And I didn't have a tech background. It was super interesting because they said, you're doing a great job managing people. You're starting to build strategic vision and insight. And with the right team, you don't have to do the tech yourself. You'll have people on your team who can do that. What you'll do is develop a vision, develop a plan, and execute. And that's what I've been doing for the past 5 years.
Oh, I love so much about that picture in my head that I'm building of that constructive session where you were basically given the tools you needed to succeed and someone saw the potential you had based on existing proof statement or what you've done. So it's all just the way leadership should work and management should work. One of the things you mentioned about managing people, not having had experience with that I think is a very common experience for people as they are promoted into management roles. I'd love to ask how you fill that gap, but also a second question around technology is when you think about personalities maybe within different arenas, say there might be a different set of personalities more common in investment banking versus say a nonprofit versus say a library versus say a technology division. Did you find that there was a difference in personalities there too?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. Thank you for those. I would say addressing your first part of your question, how do you fill that gap? I would say it's a lot of time spent listening and asking for help when you don't necessarily know the answer. It's leaning on either your manager or HR, and then really reading and doing research on your own, whether it's books, whether it's courses, etc. But nothing really can, I think, replace the real world experience here. The personalities is a really great, interesting area that has evolved quite a bit as I've managed different people and different teams. And it's starting to learn and understand what people's interests are, how they're most comfortable working, how they engage with one another. And there certainly was a lot of differences as I think about managing those who were interested in finance and the skill sets that they had, in addition to shifting over to the personalities that you see when you lead teams that are more tech focused. So it's really exciting to be able to work with so many different people. And now I'm at an intersection where my team works very closely with the investment teams. And how do you help them develop relationships with one another, knowing that they all have different skill sets, experiences, and personalities, as you indicated, so that they can develop those relationships and we can build things together.
So interesting. And I'm going to move to what's at the forefront of your mind, but just one last question about leadership. So now 5 years in, how much do you think this is an ongoing process of continuing education around leadership skills? Because clearly with our hybrid existence, leadership skills are evolving as well.
I think it is ongoing and it will always continue to evolve. The personalities that we discussed and the people aspect of it make it something that's never going to be static. And then now we have the work environments changing and the opportunities changing. So I think those of us who are willing to embrace that change as well as be open to flexibility and evolution, it's really going to be something that is really exciting, I think, for all of us in the future.
Well, speaking of evolution now, so where would you say we are in terms of the investment management industry, in terms of the embracing of business and technology, that the relevance of that function? We're all talking about data and data being the new oil. We're talking about AI, maybe starting with what's at the forefront of your mind, and we can cycle through those topics.
No, that would be great. Investment management, as we all know, is a mature business. There are always going to be headwinds in terms of differentiating yourself from the competition. So we have to think about how can we gain an edge over our peers. And I'm lucky to sit in technology where it is one area that can certainly help differentiate us. There's an opportunity, in my opinion, to help investment professionals access information more readily than they were able to previously, which allows them to really focus more time on analysis. As we think about data and how are we using data to make a difference, I spend a lot of time thinking about all the data that we're inundated with every day. It's so different today than it was 5 years ago or even a decade ago. And really, how can we help one another access that information? But in addition to accessing it, it's also seeing the relationships between data. There's so much more of it now than there was before. And in many cases, we can all get there on our own eventually, but we want to help them get there quicker. And in some cases, we may even uncover insights that the investment professionals may not be able to see on their own without the help and assistance of technology. And that's really fascinating right now.
And then, of course, AI. So we're still very much in the early stages, I think, of knowing the impact AI will have. How are you seeing it at your vantage point in terms of the impact on productivity, say building models, all the kind of the nuts and bolts that goes into being an analyst of the fundamental style in terms of maybe aggregating data? What difference will it make to the stock picker going forward?
That's a really interesting question. And as you commented, I think you're right. We all don't know entirely at this point. We are in the early stages. We do know that machine learning and machine learning models have been around for a long time and some element of AI, but we have a new generation of technology that is budding and it's evolving very quickly. I think it has the ability to really impact and change the way we work. As we discussed a little bit earlier, the ability to bring information together has always really been on the forefront of technology, but now you have the capability to bring together structured and unstructured data together. So you can think of numerical data in combination with textual data of nature, and now bring those pieces together forefront of an analyst or a portfolio manager. And that's pretty exciting. We're looking for ways that we can also leverage technology to do some of those repetitive tasks that we don't all love to do, but it's certainly necessary. But it really helps shift our time away from the repetition and allows us to focus more time on analysis and making decisions. So hopefully over time, you really do see an impact on performance and the ability to deliver outcomes to our clients.
In terms of training, say, of young personnel, and you went through investment training courses, took finance courses, business, how much of that now will have to involve technology, embracing AI? harnessing it, as I said, to speed this productivity and maybe emphasize the human side and where that's more relevant?
I think it's certainly a component. I'd like to think about, if we think about companies, and there's always a component of research and development. I think we owe it to ourselves as professionals and individuals too, in the form of learning and development. And we can always find a way to innovate. So these new technologies or these new findings or learnings, that we come across, is trying to find and spend at least 20% of your time, give or take on average, to really learn and to ask questions and to develop new skill sets or to think a little bit differently. It doesn't always have to be in the form of a course or a class or a curriculum per se. I think it's also engaging with your peers, engaging with your colleagues, and having those conversations about things that are new and different. And how does it change your perspective and how you've done things in the past? And maybe it does change, maybe it doesn't, but at least you're thinking about it.
It's a really nice rule of thumb that 20%, probably higher than most people, allocate to continuing development. But it echoes really what you said earlier about leadership and management, whether it's leading people or learning new skills or continuous learning, having a kind of a rule of thumb for, it's almost one day a week, 20%. That probably is what we need for the future.
It's certainly a goal that we all aspire towards, right?
Yeah, exactly. So going back to goals and the investment management industry, as I said, I took that vignette you painted of you going to that office with HR and the ominous turning into the opportunity as a great example, as Stephanie, of course, herself, a great example of a role model, great female leader in the industry that isn't diverse enough, I would argue. What has been your perspective throughout your career, having started in investment banking, now in investment management, of the diversity of the industry, and how do you think it's improved, or has it?
It certainly has improved. It was much different when I started, almost 20 some years ago. I think at that time, if I recall correctly, it was few and far between, to see a woman at the table and someone of color as well. I think when we think about diversity and how it's evolved, is we've thought about diversity not only in how we look, but also more importantly, the different experiences that we all have. I think we're more open to it nowadays than we have been in the past. When I first started my career, when we looked for individuals, myself included, for a specific role, you always looked at what their experience was, what was their path, what was their educational studies, how did they get from point A to point B. And I'm a great example of, maybe someone that stays within financial services, but you take a little bit of a one, that's okay. And I think that view and that flexibility has also lent to the diversity of thought, which we're starting to see more of. I think the biggest challenge, though, in finance and in financial services more broadly is really just exposure. So my example is one where I didn't grow up around it, but I found a way and I learned about it and I persevered and I moved forward. So how can we give back and how can we introduce finance to those who may not have the opportunity? And I think we have some work to do, but we can certainly do it with the younger generation.
Just moving to some personal reflections now. So when you look back at your career, were there any setbacks or challenges that you learned lessons from? And we did, I know, speak about some pivots and serendipitous ones. Anything you can share there?
Sure, happy to on this front. I spoke about leadership and the necessity to really lean on a team when I didn't particularly have skills myself. I also tend to be very analytical in nature, so I always want to have the right answer before I speak. I had to learn to really overcome that even. So when I think about what would I tell myself and what have I learned is ask the question, say what you think. There's really no wrong question or idea as long as it's appropriate for the situation. So maybe I'd call that confidence, and that's kind of built up over the years. But I think I would have learned a lot quicker if I had gotten over the thought that maybe my question was silly or that my opinion really didn't matter at that time.
And then we mentioned at the beginning that you're on the board of the Auditorium Theatre, on the board of directors there. And does this come from a love of theatre, and what is your role on that board?
Yeah, so I joined the board of directors at the Auditorium Theatre Chicago about a year ago and recently was named treasurer of the board. It is so much fun. It's a great way to give back to the community, and it's connected to both my skill in finance and my interest in music. So Many people don't know, but I did minor in music in college. And had I not had to worry about finding a job, I likely would have pursued a career in the arts in some capacity. So this is my opportunity to give back as well as be able to embrace the arts in a way that I hadn't been able to.
Well, from Stephanie's English literature focus and Vivian Lynn Thurston, Chinese dance. Why is it no surprise that another William Blair professional has an interest in the arts? So thank you for sharing that. And then in terms of mentors or people that had a particular influence on you, anyone in particular that stands out? And I always do caveat that this is not an exhaustive list in case anyone gets left off, but anyone in particular that influenced your approach to your career or life in general?
No, for sure. And as I mentioned, Stephanie has been instrumental over the past more than decade or so. But one other that I would mention was one of my first bosses, David Stoll, who advised me when I changed roles at William Blair, as well as gave me a great piece of advice early on in my career, which was always follow up. If you do what you say you're going to do, you really have an edge. So I recall writing things down when I was on a call, when I was in a meeting, and really thinking about what is that follow up and making sure that I followed his advice to always close the loop. And what's really interesting about this is most people are not capable of it because they either forget or they get distracted by other things. And this piece of advice really resonated with me over time because what it said to me was, you don't always have to be the smartest. You don't always have to be the star, but you can make up for it with work ethic. And I've always followed that piece of advice. I still remember it to this day, and it really does make a difference.
And in addition to that, any maybe creed or motto that you have internalized over the years, or alternatively, any advice for your younger self?
I would say be the best version of yourself. I really try to live up to that and remind myself of that, at least on a weekly basis. And if you don't know what that is, the best version of yourself, or you haven't gotten there yet, it can really be a fun journey to find yourself. It is super interesting because as you think about just sometimes taking a pause and reflecting on what you've done, you'll come to realize that you'll be really proud of the journey that you've taken and how much you've grown and the successes you've achieved. But you really do have to take a breath sometimes. Your life is so busy. We're always pulled in different directions. And you just have to remind yourself that you're doing the best that you can and you aspire and want to be the best version of yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Kristina. When we mentioned that this was going to be a podcast about your business and technology role, I think I was afraid it would be filled with a lot of jargon that I didn't understand, because I will admit that like many in our industry, technology can be overwhelming and it can be daunting when we think about how much there is to learn and how much we don't know what we don't know, essentially. But you have translated this for us with a very human element. And as always, in the investment management business, it does come back to people, leading them, motivating them, and encouraging them, as you said, to be their best selves. So thank you so much for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, Ethan.
I'm Ethan Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.